Joining me now, as he does each and every week, is Sky News Australia's media watchdog columnist, Gerard Henderson. Gerard, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, you've come across a grab here of Sarah Ferguson, and she's doing what Sarah Ferguson has, infamous, famous, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, interrupts. Let's have a listen.
We're going to change the temperature.
Let's not snow the audience with a discussion about net zero. There's 123 countries in the world signed up to it.
And so I'm doing what I promised.
The question was...
That is transmission lines, solar, swindle factories, capacity investments.
All right, let's just...
Secret agreements in this place where
a debate, if I may, Barnaby Joyce.
Net zero forever.
A debate, nothing to do...
This will have no effect on the climate whatsoever. What is the point of that folly?
Barnaby Joyce, not accepting your point about folly, but moving on. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, Sarah.
I just want to change the tone very slightly here because we are used to politicians appearing to be thick-skinned. The execution of power demands it, and I should say this is not a reflection on Barnaby Joyce. I just wanted to change the tone. Because tonight we'll see a slightly different side of Education Minister Jason Clare.
What on earth? That is the most bizarre...
Yeah.
That is just weird television.
Well, it was. It appealed to me. Well, Sarah Ferguson was the tone. She was half the tone. I mean, Barnaby Joyce was the tone, and Sarah Ferguson was the tone. So when she says she's going to change the tone, she means she's going to go quiet. For good reason, because I counted up all the various words, and Barnaby Joyce got 60% of the interview, and the interviewer got 40%. That's a lot of time. And then at the end, she had to say that she didn't accept that Joyce's views on climate change.
She doesn't understand maths, then, if that's the case.
Were a folly. I mean, she just said, she didn't accept that.
I don't accept that.
Well, who cares?
Yeah, who cares what you think? But also, come forward with the proposition of why. And this is the thing with climate science.
Yes.
It's something that irritates me so much about it, is that whatever we're doing, it is swallowed up. In fact, we had some reporting about we spent $30 billion to lower our energy emissions by 6%. The amount that we lowered it by, China increased by 87 times. So everything we've done has absolutely no impact on aggregate CO2 emissions, meaning we have made zero progress to solving climate change.
And there is this other point.
It's maths.
Which is that various people on the ABC and others, some other journalists and 9 newspapers and others, I mean, they live in the inner cities. And there are no transmission lines going through them, as you know. There are no massive towers. And people in rural areas, and that's what Barnaby Joyce has been talking about, do have legitimate problems about not only what's going on in their vicinity, on their land, but also how they're being treated by people who want to go in and demand certain rights given them by government to go into their land. So what Joyce is saying, whether you agree with his conclusion or not, what he's presenting is perfectly reasonable, but that's dismissed as folly by someone like Sarah Ferguson, who doesn't live near a wind farm or a solar farm that's interfering with her land.
And his constituents do, and this is the thing. So no matter what you think about Barnaby Joyce, he's representing his constituency, and he's very popular in his constituency. So for Sarah Ferguson to come from that hyper-adversarial point of view, knocking it back, she's knocking back the views of the constituency. And that's, I think, where people get irritated with the ABC.
And once upon a time, in areas of rural Australia, the ABC had a big following. I mean, it doesn't have as much as it used to have, partly because of Sky News Regional. That's right, because they're contemptuous of, and there are other things you can go to, but they're burning their viewers and their listeners because of that kind of attitude. I mean, on that interview, I mean, Barnaby Joyce has had his rough interviews, but that interview, he was feeling very strong, but he was very rational. And he was very considered. And there was nothing that that he said you could say was wrong. All you could say that was wrong was the solution, which is don't do this anymore. But what he was describing about what's happening was perfectly reasonable, and it certainly wasn't folly. And then Sarah Ferguson comes in to change the tone.
Yeah, which was more a reflection on her kind of getting cranky rather than having composure. Sure, good luck to her. Anyway, let's move on because we've got 3 cartoonists and who are doing art. Let's have a look at them as well. Maybe you can help talk through as we're getting them up on the air. But we've got Kathy Wilcox from 9, and essentially the proposition is that the Australian government is responsible for rising oceans.
Yes, it's Chris Bowen there as the man in the cartoon, and he's saying to these islanders that, somehow we're all responsible for that, and he wants to do something about it. Obviously, the opposition doesn't want to do something about it. So Chris Bowen's not selling out here. But the idea that, as you know, the idea that Australia can affect sea levels throughout the world, including the Torres Strait, is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
But it's not challenged.
Yeah, we just did the maths. So the ABC also has another cartoon by Jess Harwood. The Guardian Australia had another one.
Well, Jess Harwood saying the same as, and the Prime Minister saying something how that he wants to do something about it too, in a way. Or she's saying he's not doing enough. But as if Anthony Albanese can change the levels of the sea. I mean,
it's so naive. I think there's an arrogance in terms of our position on the global stage as well. We are a middle power, and it is great to be enthusiastic about our role on the world stage. But I wonder, do you think that Russia will cut back its emissions because of something that we are doing from a moral point of view, because we're setting the example? Because that could be the only argument that could possibly make sense is lead by example.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if China is just constantly increasing, has no intention to cut. India is increasing. Trump's doing all sorts of new things. You've got all the biggest emitters are going in the opposite direction. We're making people poorer, and there is no benefit to the climate at all, because climate science is global, it's not geocentric.
Well, you've got two dictatorships here, Russia and China, and two democracies.
We're at war with one of them, soft war with the other.
And India and the United States is the other. So they're the democracies. And the four of them together, and then you add in Indonesia. I mean, if anyone wants to go and talk to islanders, cartoonists want to draw about it, they should be having someone talk to China or Russia or Putin or Xi, President Xi, or Donald Trump or Modi in India. But they're not doing that. But the idea that, I mean, we are an influential nation, but our emissions don't make any difference.
Do you think that Albo, if he genuinely cared about rising seas and emissions, the first thing he would say, look Xi Jinping in the face, and he would say, hey, your 16,000 megatons of CO2 that you churn into the environment every year, that's bad. Can you decrease that? He wouldn't have the courage or the gumption.
Don't build any more coal power stations, which they're doing. Ours are closing down because no one is able to maintain this, the reason why they're closing down. China's building theirs, and no cartoonist ever predicts
it's getting more expensive, and I can confidently say rising sea levels have absolutely zero to do with anything that Australia does, will do, won't do. It doesn't matter. We're a statistical anomaly on the charts. It's also hard to predict a lot of this stuff, but anyway, we could talk about this all night. Let's move on. David Marr with Annabelle Crabb. Very interesting interview involving John Howard. What took place?
Well, there's this discussion about what do you do with Mark Latham, because he was elected the Labor leader, and pretty well half the Labor caucus, or just over half the Labor caucus, voted for him, and some of them are still around. And so Labor, there are all these plaques on the wall in the Labor caucus room in Canberra, all the leaders from the beginning to now, not just the Prime Ministers, all the leaders. So Mark Latham's up there, and the question is, what do you do about him? Well, they've now put up a plaque, as I understand it, it's been reported, that says he was expelled from the Labor Party because really of bad behaviour. But in fact he wasn't. He was expelled from the Labor Party because he joined the Liberal Democratic Party. And if you join another party, you would get expelled. And so did Billy Hughes in the First World War, but his photograph's still up on there. But so this was a discussion between Annabelle Crabb.
A bit of history rewriting there, isn't there? Right.
Yeah, and so this is a discussion with Annabelle Crabb, who reports on Australian politics on Late Night Live with David Marr, about what they're doing. And the issue was whether you take the photograph down or you put up this note about it. So they put up the note, and Annabelle Crabb explains that. And then David Marr says, she says, and isn't it hard not to applaud the Australian people who took a look at Latham and decided no? Now, I'm not aware that in 2004, in that election, the first time I've ever thought that David Marr voted for John Howard instead of Mark Latham. So David Marr is praising the good people of Australia for not electing Latham, but he didn't actually say how he voted. And I know David pretty well. I'd be very, very surprised if he voted for John Howard, ever. And not in that election either. But he didn't say that. So it's
I think we need to find out the truth on this. Who did he vote for?
So all the big issues were avoided. I mean, why was Latham expelled?
Yes.
How did David Marr vote? But they're very prominent, a number of very prominent Labor people. I mean, the question was, Mark Latham or Kim Beazley. And what happened was that Julia Gillard's faction, which was supporting Beazley, moved across and supported Latham. That's how he became leader. And that's the sort of history that the Labor Party doesn't want to talk about, because it is a bit embarrassing, particularly in view of Mark Latham's recent bad behaviour. But he had a lot of bad behaviour before he was elected Labor leader as well, but no one wants to talk about it.
And also, did anyone ever meet him and kind of get a vibe check?
Oh, they knew all about him.
You know, in charge of the party?
Bob Carr, then the Premier of New South, Labor Premier of New South Wales, when he heard of this, because Latham had worked for him, Bob Carr said, "Oh, Latham, new leader of the Labor Party," he said, "that'll be an interesting 12 months." And he lasted 14 months.
Yeah, yeah. Now, let's move on to the Sydney Morning Herald. And, of course, I think Sarah Ferguson, again, is involved in this. Tell me about the reporting around this story and why it's irritated you.
Well, Jillian Segal, as you know, is the special envoy for anti-Semitism, and she put out a report. I agree with most of it. I didn't agree with all of it. You wouldn't expect to, but it's a good report. But what happened was that initially in a left-wing paper, and then in The Guardian, then in the Sydney Morning Herald, it was said that her husband had given $50,000 to the Advance organisation, which is a kind of right-of-centre action group. But that's not relevant to Jillian Segal, or it's not relevant to her report. I mean, unless we're going back to the past, when women were supposed to be dependent on their husbands and responsible to their husbands. I mean, it's very insulting to say that somehow Jillian Segal's report on Segal's report on anti-Semitism in Australia has something to do with her husband's political views.
And these are the people who traditionally would barrack against that if it happened in any other situation. But here you have somebody who's advocating for pro-Jewish policies, and they are essentially using the husband. I agree. I think it's deplorable.
You'd be run out of town.
The sins of thy husband.
Yes. Be run out of town of being a sexist. That's what you'd be run out of. But if it happens in the Sydney Morning Herald or on the ABC, I mean, it's a legitimate question. Definitely. Although, to be fair, Tony Burke, the minister who was on with Sarah Ferguson, he did query this point. He said we shouldn't be talking about that.
Well, good on him for doing that, to his credit. Now, Gerard Henderson, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Really appreciate it, as always.